One side effect of the operation would become a problem for Jobs because of his obsessive diets and the weird routines of purging and fasting that he had practiced since he was a teenager. He stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks and then struggled to regain his strength. I remember coming back and sitting in that rocking chair, he told me, pointing to one in his living room. I didn't have the energy to walk. It took me a week before I could walk around the block. I pushed myself to walk to the gardens a few blocks away, then further, and within 6 months, I had my energy almost back. Unfortunately, the cancer had spread. During the operation, the doctors found 3 liver metastases. Had they operated 9 months earlier, they might have caught it before it spread, though they would never know for sure. Jobs began chemotherapy treatments, which further complicated his eating challenges. The Stanford Commencement. Jobs kept his continuing battle with the cancer secret. He told everyone that he had been cured, just as he had kept quiet about his diagnosis in October 2003. Such secrecy was not surprising. It was part of his nature. What was more surprising was his decision to speak very personally and publicly about his cancer diagnosis. Although he rarely gave speeches other than his staged product demonstrations, he accepted Stanford's invitation to give its June 2005 commencement address. He was in a reflective mood after his health scare and turning 50. Nobody is eager for a lecture, but everybody loves a story, and that was the approach Jobs chose. Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life, he began. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first was about dropping out of Reed College. The second was about how getting fired from Apple turned out to be good for him. It was his third tale that enthralled them. It was about being diagnosed with cancer and the awareness it brought. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. A lion at 50. For his 30th and 40th birthdays, Jobs had celebrated with the stars of Silicon Valley and other assorted celebrities. But when he turned 50 in 2005, after coming back from his cancer surgery, the surprise party that his wife arranged featured mainly his closest friends and professional colleagues. It was at the comfortable San Francisco home of some friends, and the great chef, Alice Waters, prepared salmon from Scotland, along with couscous and a variety of garden-raised vegetables. Tim Cook had done a good job running the company during Jobs' absence. He kept Apple's temperamental actors performing well, and he avoided stepping into the limelight. Some people resent the fact that Steve gets credit for everything, but I've never given a rat's ass about that, said Cook. Frankly speaking, I'd prefer my name never be in the paper. When Jobs returned from his medical leave, Cook resumed his role as the person who kept the moving parts at Apple tightly meshed and remained unfazed by Jobs' tantrums. What I learned about Steve was that people mistook some of his comments as ranting or negativism, but it was really just the way he showed passion. So that's how I processed it, and I never took issues personally. In many ways, he was Jobs' mirror image, unflappable, steady in his moods. I'm a good negotiator, but he's probably better than me because he's a cool customer, Jobs later said. After adding a bit more praise, he quietly added a reservation, one that was serious but rarely spoken. But Tim's not a product person, per se. In the fall of 2005, after returning from his medical leave, Jobs tapped Cook to become Apple's chief operating officer. Around that time, Jobs' old friend John Rubinstein, his hardware lieutenant, decided to leave. Rubinstein was upset by Cook's ascendancy and frazzled after working for 9 years under Jobs. Their shouting matches became more frequent. There was also a substantive issue. Rubinstein was repeatedly clashing with Johnny Ive, who used to work for him and now reported directly to Jobs. Finally, Ive told Jobs, "It's him or me." Jobs chose Ive. Jobs was able to build a new management team that was less contentious and a bit more subdued. Even though there was a surface sameness to his top team, all were middle-aged white males, there was a range of styles. Ive was emotional and expressive. Cook was as cool as steel. They all knew they were expected to be deferential to Jobs, while also pushing back on his ideas and being willing to argue. A tricky balance to maintain, but each did it well. "I realized very early that if you didn't voice your opinion, he would mow you down," said Cook. "He takes contrary positions to create more discussion, because it may lead to a better result. So if you don't feel comfortable disagreeing, then you'll never survive." The key venue for freewheeling discourse was the Monday morning executive team gathering, which started at 9 and went for 3 or 4 hours. The focus was always on the future. What should each product do next? What new things should be developed? Jobs also used the meetings to enforce focus. At Robert Friedland's farm, his job had been to prune the apple trees so that they would stay strong, and that became a metaphor for his pruning at Apple. Instead of encouraging each group to let product lines proliferate based on marketing considerations or permitting 1,000 ideas to bloom, Jobs insisted that Apple focus on just 2 or 3 priorities at a time. "There is no one better at turning off the noise that is going on around him," Cook said. "That allows him to focus on a few things and say no to many things. Few people are really good at that." In order to institutionalize the lessons that he and his team were learning, Jobs started an in-house center called Apple University. He hired Joel Podolny, who was dean of the Yale School of Management, to compile a series of case studies analyzing important decisions the company had made, including the switch to the Intel microprocessor and the decision to open the Apple stores. Top executives spent time teaching the cases to new employees so that the Apple style of decision-making would be embedded in the culture. In ancient Rome, when a victorious general paraded through the streets, legend has it that he was sometimes trailed by a servant whose job it was to repeat to him, "Memento mori." Remember, you will die. A reminder of mortality would help the hero keep things in perspective, instill some humility. Jobs's memento mori had been delivered by his doctors, but it did not instill humility. Instead, he roared back after his recovery with even more passion. "He came back on a mission," said Cook. "Even though he was now running a large company, he kept making bold moves that I don't think anybody else would have done." For a while, there was some evidence, or at least hope, that he had tempered his personal style, that facing cancer and turning 50 had caused him to be a bit less brutish when he was upset. Eventually, however, the rough edges returned. One thing that did mellow was his attitude toward Bill Gates. Microsoft had kept its end of the bargain it made in 1997 when it agreed to continue developing great software for the Macintosh. Plus, it was becoming less relevant as a competitor, having failed thus far to replicate Apple's digital hub strategy. Gates and Jobs had very different approaches to products and innovation, but their rivalry had produced in each a surprising self-awareness. For their All Things Digital conference in May 2007, the Wall Street Journal columnists Walt Mossberg and Kara Swisher worked to get them together for a joint interview. The result was a fascinating duet in which each wunderkind of the digital age spoke warily and then warmly about the other. Most memorably, they gave candid answers when asked what each had learned from observing the other. "Well, I'd give a lot to have Steve's taste," Gates answered. Jobs was a natural in terms of intuitive taste. He recalled how he and Jobs used to sit together reviewing the software that Microsoft was making for the Macintosh. I'd see Steve make the decision based on a sense of people and product that, is hard for me to explain. The way he does things is just different, and I think it's magical. And in that case, wow. Jobs stared at the floor. Later, he told me that he was blown away by how honest and gracious Gates had just been. Jobs was equally honest, though not quite as gracious when his turn came. He described the great divide between the Apple theology of building end-to-end integrated products and Microsoft's openness to licensing its software to competing hardware makers. In the music market, the integrated approach, as manifested in his iTunes iPod package, was proving to be the better, he noted, but Microsoft's decoupled approach was faring better in the personal computer market. One question he raised in an offhand way was, which approach might work better for mobile phones? Then he went on to make an insightful point. This difference in design philosophy, he said, led him and Apple to be less good at collaborating with other companies. Because Woz and I started the company based on doing the whole banana, we weren't so good at partnering with people, he said. And I think if Apple could have had a little more of that in its DNA, it would have served it extremely well. The iPhone. 3 revolutionary products in one. By 2005, iPod sales were skyrocketing. An astonishing 20 million were sold that year, quadruple the number of the year before. That is why Jobs was worried. He was always obsessing about what could mess us up, board member Art Levinson recalled. The conclusion he had come to, the device that can eat our lunch is the cell phone. So Jobs and his team became excited about the prospect of building a phone that they would want to use. That's the best motivator of all, Jobs later said. Another motivator was the potential market. More than 825 million mobile phones were sold in 2005 to everyone from grammar schoolers to grandmothers. Their initial approach was to modify the iPod. They tried to use the track wheel as a way for a user to scroll through phone options and without a keyboard try to enter numbers. It was not a natural fit. At that time, there was a second project underway at Apple, a secret effort to build a tablet computer. In 2005, these narratives intersected, and the ideas for the tablet flowed into the planning for the phone. In other words, the idea for the iPad actually came before and helped to shape the birth of the iPhone. One of the engineers who were developing a tablet PC at Microsoft was married to a friend of Laureen and Steve Jobs, and for his 50th birthday, he wanted to have a dinner party that included them along with Bill and Melinda Gates. Jobs went, a bit reluctantly. Steve was actually quite friendly to me at the dinner, Gates recalled, but he wasn't particularly friendly to the birthday guy. Gates was annoyed that the guy kept revealing information about the tablet PC he had developed for Microsoft. "He's our employee, and he's revealing our intellectual property," Gates recounted. Jobs was also annoyed, and it had just the consequence that Gates feared. As Jobs recalled, "This guy badgered me about how Microsoft was going to completely change the world with this tablet PC software and eliminate all notebook computers, and Apple ought to license his Microsoft software. But he was doing the device all wrong. It had a stylus. As soon as you have a stylus, you're dead." This dinner was like the 10th time he talked to me about it, and I was so sick of it that I came home and said, "Fuck this. Let's show him what a tablet can really be." Jobs went into the office the next day, gathered his team, and said, "I want to make a tablet, and it can't have a keyboard or a stylus. So could you guys come up with a multi-touch, touch-sensitive display for me?" he asked. It took them about 6 months, but they came up with a crude but workable prototype. It was, in fact, such a good idea that Jobs realized that it could solve the problem they were having creating an interface for the proposed cell phone. That project was far more important, so he put the tablet development on hold while the multi-touch interface was adopted for a phone-sized screen. "If it worked on a phone," he recalled, "I knew we could go back and use it on a tablet." The result was a device that displays a numerical pad when you want to dial a phone number, a typewriter keyboard when you want to write, and whatever buttons you might need for each particular activity. And then they all disappear when you're watching a video. By having software replace hardware, the interface became fluid and flexible. Gorilla Glass. Jobs became infatuated with different materials the way he did with certain foods. "After we did metal, I looked at Johnny and said that we had to master glass," said Jobs. For the Apple stores, they had created huge window panes and glass stairs. For the iPhone, the original plan was for it to have a plastic screen like the iPod. But Jobs decided it would feel much more elegant and substantive if the screens were glass. So he set about finding a glass that would be strong and resistant to scratches. The natural place to look was Asia, where the glass for the stores was being made. But Jobs' friend, John Seely Brown, who was on the board of Corning Glass in upstate New York, told him that he should talk to that company's young and dynamic CEO, Wendell Weeks. And Jobs invited Weeks to Cupertino. Jobs described the type of glass Apple wanted for the iPhone, and Weeks told him that Corning had developed a chemical exchange process in the 1960s that led to what they dubbed Gorilla Glass. It was incredibly strong, but it had never found a market, so Corning quit making it. Jobs said he wanted as much Gorilla Glass as Corning could make within 6 months. "We don't have the capacity," Weeks replied. "None of our plants make the glass now." "Don't be afraid," Jobs replied. "Get your mind around it. You can do it." As Weeks retold this story, he shook his head in astonishment. "We did it in under 6 months," he said. "We produced a glass that had never been made." In his airy office, Weeks has just one framed memento on display. It's a message Jobs sent the day the iPhone came out. "We couldn't have done it without you." The design. On many of his major projects, Jobs pressed pause as they neared completion and decided to make major revisions. The problem was that the iPhone should have been all about the display, but in their current design, the case competed with the display instead of getting out of the way. The new design ended up with just a thin stainless steel bezel that allowed the Gorilla Glass display to go right to the edge. Every part of the device seemed to defer to the screen. One aspect of the design which reflected not only Jobs' perfectionism, but also his desire to control, was that the device was tightly sealed. The case could not be opened, even to change the battery. By not having a replaceable battery, it was possible to make the iPhone much thinner. For Jobs, thinner was always better. "He's always believed that thin is beautiful," said Tim Cook. "You can see that in all of the work. We have the thinnest notebook, the thinnest smartphone, and we made the iPad thin and then even thinner." The launch. For the unveiling at the January 2007 Macworld in San Francisco, Jobs invited back Andy Hertzfeld, Bill Atkinson, Steve Wozniak, and the 1984 Macintosh team, as he had done when he launched the iMac. In a career of dazzling product presentations, this may have been his best. "Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything," he began. He referred to two earlier examples: the original Macintosh, which changed the whole computer industry, and the first iPod, which changed the entire music industry. Then he carefully built up to the product he was about to launch. Today, we're introducing three revolutionary products of this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. He repeated the list for emphasis, then asked, "Are you getting it? These are not three separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone." When the iPhone went on sale 5 months later, at the end of June 2007, Apple's competitors emphasized that at $500, it cost too much to be successful. By the end of 2010, Apple had sold 90 million iPhones, and it reaped more than half of the total profits generated in the global cell phone market. Round 2. The cancer recurs. By the beginning of 2008, it was clear to Jobs and his doctors that his cancer was spreading. When they had taken out his pancreatic tumors in 2004, he had the cancer genome partially sequenced. That helped his doctors determine which pathways were broken, and they were treating him with targeted therapies that they thought were most likely to work. He was also being treated for pain, usually with morphine-based analgesics. There was another health issue that became increasingly problematic, one that medical researchers didn't focus on as rigorously as they did cancer or pain. He was having eating problems and losing weight. Partly this was because he had lost much of his pancreas, which produces the enzymes needed to digest protein and other nutrients. It was also because the morphine reduced his appetite. And then there was the psychological component, which the doctors barely knew how to address. Since his early teens, he had indulged his weird obsession with extremely restrictive diets and fasts. The family hired a gentle and versatile cook, Briar Brown, who once worked for Alice Waters at Chez Panisse. He came each afternoon and made a panoply of healthy offerings for dinner, which used the herbs and vegetables that Powell grew in their garden. When Jobs expressed any whim, carrot salad, pasta with basil, lemongrass soup, Brown would quietly and patiently find a way to make it. On some nights he would stare at the floor and ignore all of the dishes set out on the long kitchen table. When others were halfway through their meal, he would abruptly get up and leave, saying nothing. It was stressful for his family. They watched him lose 40 pounds during the spring of 2008. When Jobs introduced the iPhone 3G in June 2008, he was so thin that it overshadowed the product announcement. Partly due to concern about Jobs' weight loss, Apple's stock price drifted from $188 at the beginning of June 2008 down to $156 at the end of July. Matters were not helped in late August when Bloomberg News mistakenly released its pre-packaged obituary of Jobs, which ended up on Gawker. But his gaunt appearance was not reassuring. By early October, the stock price had sunk to $97. The blogosphere erupted with speculation about his health, much of which had the odious smell of truth. Jobs was furious and felt violated. He was also annoyed that Apple wasn't being more active in pushing back. So on January 5, 2009, he wrote and released a misleading open letter. He claimed that he was skipping Macworld because he wanted to spend more time with his family. As many of you know, I have been losing weight throughout 2008, he added. My doctors think they have found the cause, a hormone imbalance that has been robbing me of the proteins my body needs to be healthy. Sophisticated blood tests have confirmed this diagnosis. The remedy for this nutritional problem is relatively simple. There was a kernel of truth to this, albeit a small one. One of the hormones created by the pancreas is glucagon, which is the flip side of insulin. Glucagon causes your liver to release blood sugar. Jobs' tumor had metastasized into his liver and was wreaking havoc. In effect, his body was devouring itself, so his doctors gave him drugs to try to lower the glucagon level. He was very sick at this point, despite his upbeat statement, and also in excruciating pain. He had undertaken another round of cancer drug therapy, and it had grueling side effects. His skin started drying out and cracking. Jobs finally agreed to go on medical leave. He made the announcement on January 14, 2009, in another open letter to the Apple staff. During the past week, I have learned that my health-related issues are more complex than I originally thought. Tim Cook would again take over daily operations, but Jobs said that he would remain CEO, continue to be involved in major decisions, and be back by June. Memphis. The head of Jobs' oncology team was Stanford University's George Fisher, a leading researcher on gastrointestinal and colorectal cancers. He had been warning Jobs for months that he might have to consider a liver transplant, but that was the type of information that Jobs resisted processing. Powell was glad that Fisher kept raising the possibility because she knew it would take repeated proddings to get her husband to consider the idea. He finally became convinced in January 2009, just after he claimed his hormonal imbalance could be treated easily. But there was a problem. He was put on the wait list for a liver transplant in California, but it became clear he would never get one there in time. The number of available donors with his blood type was small. Every donation is closely audited. Data are available on public websites, and you can monitor your status on the wait list at any time. Powell became the troller of the organ donation websites, checking in every night to see how many were on the wait lists. You can do the math, which I did, and it would have been way past June before he got a liver in California, and the doctors felt that his liver would give out in about April, she recalled. So she started asking questions and discovered that it was permissible to be on the list in 2 different states at the same time. There are 2 major requirements. The potential recipient had to be able to get to the chosen hospital within 8 hours, which Jobs could do thanks to his plane, and the doctors from that hospital had to evaluate the patient in person before adding him or her to the list. George Riley, the San Francisco lawyer who often served as Apple's outside counsel, was a caring Tennessee gentleman, and he had become close to Jobs. His parents had both been doctors at Methodist University Hospital in Memphis. He was born there, and he was a friend of James Eason, who ran the Transplant Institute there. Riley arranged for Eason to fly to Palo Alto and conduct the required evaluation there. By late February 2009, Jobs had secured a place on the Tennessee list, as well as the one in California, and the nervous waiting began. He was declining rapidly by the first week in March, and the waiting time was projected to be 21 days. It was dreadful, Powell recalled. It didn't look like we would make it in time. Every day became more excruciating. He moved up to third on the list by mid-March, then second, and finally first. But then days went by. The awful reality was that upcoming events like St. Patrick's Day and March Madness — Memphis was in the 2009 tournament and was a regional site — offered a greater likelihood of getting a donor because the drinking causes a spike in car accidents. Indeed, on the weekend of March 21, 2009, a young man in his mid-20s was killed in a car crash, and his organs were made available. Jobs and his wife flew to Memphis, where they landed just before 4 a.m. and were met by Eason. A car was waiting on the tarmac, and everything was staged so that the admitting paperwork was done as they rushed to the hospital. The transplant was a success, but not reassuring. When the doctors took out his liver, they found spots on the peritoneum, the thin membrane that surrounds internal organs. In addition, there were tumors throughout the liver, which meant it was likely that the cancer had migrated elsewhere as well. It had apparently mutated and grown quickly. They took samples and did more genetic mapping. A few days later, they needed to perform another procedure. Jobs, against all advice, insisted they not pump out his stomach, and when they sedated him, he aspirated some of the contents into his lungs and developed pneumonia. At that point, they thought he might die. As he described it later, "I almost died because in this routine procedure they blew it. Laureen was there, and they flew my children in because they did not think I would make it through the night." Reed was looking at colleges with one of Laureen's brothers. "We had a private plane pick him up near Dartmouth and tell them what was going on. A plane also picked up the girls. They thought it might be the last chance they had to see me conscious. But I made it." Powell took charge of overseeing the treatment, staying in the hospital room all day and watching each of the monitors vigilantly. "Laureen was a beautiful tiger protecting him," recalled Johnny Ive, who came as soon as Jobs could receive visitors. Her mother and 3 brothers came down at various times to keep her company. Jobs' sister, Mona Simpson, also hovered protectively. She and George Riley were the only people Jobs would allow to fill in for Powell at his bedside. "Laureen's family helped us take care of the kids. Her mom and brothers were great," Jobs later said. "I was very fragile and not cooperative, but an experience like that binds you together in a deep way." Powell came every day at 7 a.m. and gathered the relevant data, which he put on a spreadsheet. It was very complicated because there were a lot of different things going on, she recalled. When James Eason and his team of doctors arrived at 9 a.m., she would have a meeting with them to coordinate all aspects of Jobs' treatment. At 9 p.m., before she left, she would prepare a report on how each of the vital signs and other measurements were trending, along with a set of questions she wanted answered the next day. "It allowed me to engage my brain and stay focused," she recalled. Eason did what no one at Stanford had fully done: take charge of all aspects of the medical care. Since he ran the facility, he could coordinate the transplant recovery, cancer tests, pain treatments, nutrition, rehabilitation, and nursing. He would even stop at the convenience store to get the energy drinks Jobs liked. Two of the nurses were from tiny towns in Mississippi, and they became Jobs's favorites. They were solid family women and not intimidated by him. Eason arranged for them to be assigned only to Jobs. To manage Steve, you have to be persistent, recalled Tim Cook. Eason managed Steve and forced him to do things that no one else could, things that were good for him that may not have been pleasant. Despite all the coddling, Jobs at times almost went crazy. He chafed at not being in control, and he sometimes hallucinated or became angry. Even when he was barely conscious, his strong personality came through. At one point, the pulmonologist tried to put a mask over his face when he was deeply sedated. Jobs ripped it off and mumbled that he hated the design and refused to wear it. Though barely able to speak, he ordered them to bring 5 different options for the mask, and he would pick a design he liked. The doctors looked at Powell, puzzled. She was finally able to distract him so they could put on the mask. He also hated the oxygen monitor they put on his finger. He told them it was ugly and too complex. He suggested ways it could be designed more simply. He was very attuned to every nuance of the environment and objects around him, and that drained him, Powell recalled. One day, when he was still floating in and out of consciousness, Powell's close friend, Catherine Smith, came to visit. Her relationship with Jobs had not always been the best, but Powell insisted that she come by the bedside. He motioned her over, signaled for a pad and pen, and wrote, "I want my iPhone." Smith took it off the dresser and brought it to him. Taking her hand, he showed her the swipe to open function and made her play with the menus. Jobs' relationship with Lisa Brennan Jobs, his daughter with his first girlfriend Chrisanne, had frayed. She had graduated from Harvard, moved to New York City, and rarely communicated with her father. But she flew down to Memphis twice, and he appreciated it. "It meant a lot to me that she would do that," he recalled. Unfortunately, he didn't tell her at the time. Many of the people around Jobs found Lisa could be as demanding as her father, but Powell welcomed her and tried to get her involved. It was a relationship she wanted to restore. As Jobs got better, much of his feisty personality returned. He still had his bile ducts. When he started to recover, he passed quickly through the phase of gratitude and went right back into the mode of being grumpy and in charge, Cat Smith recalled. "We were all wondering if he was going to come out of this with a kinder perspective, but he didn't." He also remained a finicky eater, which was more of a problem than ever. He would eat only fruit smoothies, and he would demand that 7 or 8 of them be lined up so he could find an option that might satisfy him. He would touch the spoon to his mouth for a tiny taste and pronounce, "That's no good. That one's no good either." Finally, Eason pushed back. "You know, this isn't a matter of taste," he lectured. "Stop thinking of this as food. Start thinking of it as medicine." Jobs' mood buoyed when he was able to have visitors from Apple. Tim Cook came down regularly and filled him in on the progress of new products. You could see him brighten every time the talk turned to Apple, Cook said. It was like the light turned on. He loved the company deeply, and he seemed to live for the prospect of returning. Details would energize him. When Cook described a new model of the iPhone, Jobs spent the next hour discussing not only what to call it, they agreed on iPhone 3GS, but also the size and font of the GS, including whether the letters should be capitalized, yes, and italicized, no. One day, Riley arranged a surprise after-hours visit to Sun's studio, the red brick shrine where Elvis, Johnny Cash, B.B. King, and many other rock and roll pioneers recorded. They were given a private tour, and a history lecture by one of the young staffers who sat with Jobs on the cigarette-scarred bench that Jerry Lee Lewis used. Jobs was arguably the most influential person in the music industry at the time, but the kid didn't recognize him in his emaciated state. As they were leaving, Jobs told Riley, "That kid was really smart. We should hire him for iTunes." So Riley called Eddie Q, who flew the boy out to California for an interview, and ended up hiring him to help build the early R&B and rock and roll sections of iTunes. When Riley went back to see his friends at Sun Studio later, they said that it proved, as their slogan said, that your dreams can still come true at Sun Studio. Return. At the end of May 2009, Jobs flew back from Memphis on his jet with his wife and sister. They were met at the San Jose airfield by Tim Cook and Johnny Ive, who came aboard as soon as the plane landed. You could see in his eyes his excitement at being back, Cook recalled. He had fight in him and was raring to go. Powell pulled out a bottle of sparkling apple cider and toasted her husband, and everyone embraced. Jobs was in a dark mental state after his return to Palo Alto. He was coming to grips with the thought that he might not be indispensable to the company. Apple stock had fared well while he was away. On one conference call with analysts, shortly after Jobs went on leave, Cook departed from his unemotional style to give a rousing declaration of why Apple would continue to soar even with Jobs absent. "We believe that we are on the face of the earth to make great products, and that's not changing. We are constantly focusing on innovating. We believe in the simple, not the complex. We believe that we need to own and control the primary technologies behind the products that we make and participate only in markets where we can make a significant contribution. We believe in saying no to thousands of projects so that we can really focus on the few that are truly important and meaningful to us. And I think, regardless of who is in what job, those values are so embedded in this company that Apple will do extremely well." It sounded like something Jobs would say and had said, but the press dubbed it the Cook Doctrine. Jobs was rankled and deeply depressed, especially about the last line. He didn't know whether to be proud or hurt that it might be true. There was talk that he might step aside and become chairman rather than CEO. A board meeting was scheduled a few days after he returned, and Jobs surprised everyone by making an appearance. He ambled in and was able to stay for most of the meeting. By early June, he was holding daily meetings at his house, and by the end of the month, he was back at work. Would he now, after facing death, be more mellow? His colleagues quickly got an answer. On his first day back, he startled his top team by throwing a series of tantrums. Tim Cook took it in stride. "I've never seen Steve hold back from expressing his view or passion," he later said, "but that was good." His public return came on September 9th, when he took the stage at the company's regular fall music event. After a moment of exultation, "I'm vertical, I'm back at Apple, and I'm loving every day of it." He unveiled the new line of iPod Nanos with video cameras in 9 different colors of anodized aluminum. By the beginning of 2010, he had recovered most of his strength, and he threw himself back into work for what would be one of his and Apple's most productive years. He had hit 2 consecutive home runs since launching Apple's digital hub strategy, the iPod and the iPhone. Now he was going to swing for another. The iPad. Into the post-PC era. Back in 2002, Jobs had been annoyed by the Microsoft engineer who kept proselytizing about the tablet computer software he had developed, which allowed users to input information on the screen with a stylus or pen. A few manufacturers released tablet PCs that year using the software, but none made a dent in the universe. The tablet project got a boost in 2007 when Jobs was considering ideas for a low-cost netbook computer. At an executive team brainstorming session one Monday, Ive asked why it needed a keyboard hinged to the screen. That was expensive and bulky. Put the keyboard on the screen using a multi-touch interface, he suggested. Jobs agreed. So the resources were directed to revving up the tablet project rather than designing a netbook. The usual excitement that Jobs was able to gin up for a product launch paled in comparison to the frenzy that built for the iPad unveiling on January 27, 2010 in San Francisco. The Economist put him on its cover, robed, haloed, and holding what was dubbed the Jesus tablet. As if to underscore the historic nature of the launch, Jobs invited back many of the old-timers from his early Apple days. Jobs did his usual masterly job of putting a new device into context, as he had done for the iPhone 3 years earlier. He drove a stake through the heart of the netbook concept. Netbooks aren't better at anything, he said. The invited guests and employees cheered. But we have something that is. We call it the iPad. With his final slide, Jobs emphasized one of the themes of his life, which was embodied by the iPad, a sign showing the corner of Technology Street and Liberal Arts Street. The reason Apple can create products like the iPad is that we've always tried to be at the intersection of technology and liberal arts, he concluded. The iPad was the digital reincarnation of the Whole Earth catalog, the place where creativity met tools for living. For once, the initial reaction was not a hallelujah chorus. The iPad was not yet available. It would go on sale in April, and some who watched Jobs' demo were not quite sure what it was. There was also the requisite dismissal from Bill Gates. I still think that some mixture of voice, the pen, and a real keyboard, in other words, a netbook, will be the mainstream. He continued to insist that the Microsoft approach of using a stylus for input would prevail. I've been predicting a tablet with a stylus for many years, he told me. I will eventually turn out to be right or be dead. The public carping subsided when the iPad went on sale in April and people got their hands on it. Both Time and Newsweek put it on the cover. The tough thing about writing about Apple products is that they come with a lot of hype wrapped around them, Lev Grossman wrote in Time. The other tough thing about writing about Apple products is that sometimes the hype is true. His main reservation, a substantive one, was that while it's a lovely device for consuming content, it doesn't do much to facilitate its creation. Computers, especially the Macintosh, had become tools that allowed people to make music, videos, websites, and blogs which could be posted for the world to see. The iPad shifts the emphasis from creating content to merely absorbing and manipulating it. It mutes you, turns you back into a passive consumer of other people's masterpieces. It was a criticism Jobs took to heart. He set about making sure that the next version of the iPad would emphasize ways to facilitate artistic creation by the user. Newsweek's cover line was, "What's so great about the iPad? Everything." The question, "What's on your iPad?" replaced "What's on your iPod?" Jobs was stirred by a story which he forwarded to me by Michael Noor on Forbes.com. Noor was reading a science fiction novel on his iPad while staying at a dairy farm in a rural area north of Bogota, Colombia, when a poor 6-year-old boy who cleaned the stables came up to him. Curious, Noor handed him the device. With no instruction and never having seen a computer before, the boy started using it intuitively. He began swiping the screen, launching apps, playing a pinball game. Steve Jobs has designed a powerful computer that an illiterate 6-year-old can use without instruction, Noor wrote. If that isn't magical, I don't know what is. In less than a month, Apple sold 1 million iPads. By some measures, it became the most successful consumer product launch in history. Apps. The success of the iPad came not just from the beauty of the hardware, but from the applications known as apps that allowed you to indulge in all sorts of delightful activities. You could sling Angry Birds with the swipe of your finger, track your stocks, watch movies, read books and magazines, catch up on the news, play games, and waste glorious amounts of time. Once again, the integration of the hardware, software, and store made it easy. But the apps also allowed the platform to be sort of open, in a very controlled way, to outside developers who wanted to create software and content for it. Open, that is, like a carefully curated and gated community garden. The apps phenomenon began with the iPhone. When it first came out in early 2007, there were no apps you could buy from outside developers, and Jobs initially resisted allowing them. He didn't want outsiders to create applications for the iPhone that could mess it up, infect it with viruses, or pollute its integrity. Jobs soon figured out that there was a way to have the best of both worlds. He would permit outsiders to write apps, but they would have to meet strict standards, be tested and approved by Apple, and be sold only through the iTunes Store. The App Store for the iPhone opened on iTunes in July 2008. The billionth download came 9 months later. By the time the iPad went on sale in April 2010, there were 185,000 available iPhone apps. By July 2011, there were 500,000 apps for both devices, and there had been more than 15 billion downloads of them. New battles and echoes of old ones. Google, open versus closed. A few days after he unveiled the iPad in January 2010, Jobs had a town hall meeting with employees at Apple's campus. Instead of exulting about their transformative new product, however, he went into a rant against Google for producing the rival Android operating system. Jobs was furious that Google had decided to compete with Apple in the phone business. "We did not enter the search business," he said. "They entered the phone business. Make no mistake, they want to kill the iPhone. We won't let them." A few minutes later, after the meeting moved on to another topic, Jobs returned to his tirade to attack Google's famous values slogan. "I want to go back to that other question first and say one more thing. This 'don't be evil' mantra, it's bullshit." Jobs felt personally betrayed. Google's CEO, Eric Schmidt, had been on the Apple board during the development of the iPhone and iPad, and Google's founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, had treated him as a mentor. He felt ripped off. Android's touchscreen interface was adopting more and more of the features, multi-touch, swiping, a grid of app icons, that Apple had created. Jobs had tried to dissuade Google from developing Android. He had gone to Google's headquarters near Palo Alto in 2008 and gotten into a shouting match with Page, Brin, and the head of the Android development team, Andy Rubin. Because Schmidt was then on the Apple board, he recused himself from discussions involving the iPhone. I said we would, if we had good relations, guarantee Google access to the iPhone and guarantee it one or two icons on the home screen, he recalled. But he also threatened that if Google continued to develop Android and used any iPhone features, such as multi-touch, he would sue. At first, Google avoided copying certain features, but in January 2010, HTC introduced an Android phone that boasted multi-touch and many other aspects of the iPhone's look and feel. That was the context for Jobs' pronouncement that Google's "Don't be evil" slogan was bullshit. So Apple filed suit against HTC, and by extension Android, alleging infringement of 20 of its patents. Among them were patents covering various multi-touch gestures, swipe to open, double tap to zoom, pinch and expand, and the sensors that determined how a device was being held. As he sat in his house in Palo Alto the week the lawsuit was filed, he became angrier than I had ever seen him. Our lawsuit is saying, Google, you fucking ripped off the iPhone. Wholesale ripped us off. Grand theft. I will spend my last dying breath if I need to, and I will spend every penny of Apple's $40 billion in the bank to right this wrong. I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. I'm willing to go to thermonuclear war on this. They are scared to death because they know they are guilty. Outside of search, Google's products, Android, Google Docs, are shit. A few days after this rant, Jobs got a call from Schmidt, who had resigned from the Apple board the previous summer. He suggested they get together for coffee, and they met at a cafe in a Palo Alto shopping center. We spent half the time talking about personal matters, then half the time on his perception that Google had stolen Apple's user interface designs, recalled Schmidt. When it came to the latter subject, Jobs did most of the talking. Google had ripped him off, he said in colorful language. We've got you red-handed, he told Schmidt. I'm not interested in settling. I don't want your money. If you offer me $5 billion, I won't want it. I've got plenty of money. I want you to stop using our ideas in Android. That's all I want. They resolved nothing. Underlying the dispute was an even more fundamental issue, one that had unnerving historical resonance. Google presented Android as an open platform. Its open source code was freely available for multiple hardware makers to use on whatever phones or tablets they built. Jobs, of course, had a dogmatic belief that Apple should closely integrate its operating systems with its hardware. So what did Bill Gates think as he watched Jobs, with his closed strategy, go into battle against Google as he had done against Microsoft 25 years earlier? Eventually, I think, open will succeed, but that's where I come from. In the long run, the coherence thing, you can't stay with that. Jobs believed in the coherence thing. Even if Google's approach might eventually win in the marketplace, Jobs found it repellent. I like being responsible for the whole user experience. We do it not to make money. We do it because we want to make great products, not crap like Android. The App Store and control. Jobs had a tougher time navigating the controversies over Apple's desire to keep tight control over which apps could be downloaded onto the iPhone and iPad. Guarding against apps that contained viruses or violated the user's privacy made sense. preventing apps that took users to other websites to buy subscriptions rather than doing it through the iTunes Store at least had a business rationale. But Jobs and his team went further. They decided to ban any app that defamed people, might be politically explosive, or was deemed by Apple's censors to be pornographic. There was something unnerving about Apple's decreeing that those who bought their products shouldn't look at controversial political cartoons, or for that matter, porn. The humor site, esarcasm.com, launched a "Yes, Steve, I Want Porn" web campaign. "We are dirty, sex-obsessed miscreants who need access to smut 24 hours a day," the site declared. "Either that, or we just enjoy the idea of an uncensored, open society where a techno-dictator doesn't decide what we can and cannot see." Here comes the sun. There were a few things that needed to be resolved for the career of Steve Jobs to be complete. Among them was an end to the 30 years' war with the band he loved, the Beatles. In 2007, Apple had settled its trademark battle with Apple Corp., the holding company of the Beatles, which had first sued the fledgling computer company over use of the name in 1978. But that still did not get the Beatles into the iTunes Store. The band was the last major holdout, primarily because it had not resolved with EMI Music, which owned most of its songs, how to handle the digital rights. By the summer of 2010, the Beatles and EMI had sorted things out. Eddie Q, vice president for the iTunes Store, said getting the Beatles on iTunes was the culmination of why we got into the music business. To infinity, the cloud, the spaceship, and beyond. The iPad 2. Even before the iPad went on sale, Jobs was thinking about what should be in the iPad 2. It needed front and back cameras, everyone knew that was coming, and he definitely wanted it to be thinner. But there was a peripheral issue that he focused on that most people hadn't thought about. The cases that people used covered the beautiful lines of the iPad and detracted from the screen. They made fatter what should be thinner. They put a pedestrian cloak on a device that should be magical in all of its aspects. Around that time, he read an article about magnets, cut it out, and handed it to Johnny Ive. The magnets had a cone of attraction that could be precisely focused. Perhaps they could be used to align a detachable cover. That way, it could snap onto the front of an iPad, but not have to engulf the entire device. One of the guys in Ive's group worked out how to make a detachable cover that could connect with a magnetic hinge. When you began to open it, the screen would pop to life like the face of a tickled baby, and then the cover could fold into a stand. It was not high-tech, it was purely mechanical, but it was enchanting. It also was another example of Jobs' desire for end-to-end integration. The cover and the iPad had been designed together so that the magnets and hinge all connected seamlessly. The iPad 2 would have many improvements, but this cheeky little cover, which most other CEOs would never have bothered with, was the one that would elicit the most smiles. Because Jobs was on another medical leave, he was not expected to be at the launch of the iPad 2, scheduled for March 2nd, 2011, in San Francisco. But when the invitations were sent out, he told me that I should try to be there. It was the usual scene: top Apple executives in the front row, Tim Cook eating energy bars, and the sound system blaring the appropriate Beatles songs, building up to "You Say You Want a Revolution" and "Here Comes the Sun." Reed Jobs arrived at the last minute with two rather wide-eyed freshman dorm mates. We've been working on this product for a while, and I just didn't want to miss today," Jobs said as he ambled on stage, looking scarily gaunt, but with a jaunty smile. The crowd erupted in whoops, hollers, and a standing ovation. He began his demo of the iPad 2 by showing off the new cover. This time, the case and the product were designed together, he explained. Then he moved on to address a criticism that had been rankling him because it had some merit. The original iPad had been better at consuming content than at creating it. So Apple had adapted its two best creative applications for the Macintosh, GarageBand and iMovie, and made powerful versions available for the iPad. Jobs showed how easy it was to compose and orchestrate a song, or put music and special effects into your home videos and post or share such creations using the new iPad. Once again, he ended his presentation with the slide showing the intersection of Liberal Arts Street and Technology Street. And this time, he gave one of the clearest expressions of his credo, that true creativity and simplicity comes from integrating the whole widget, hardware and software, and for that matter, content and covers and sales clerks, rather than allowing things to be open and fragmented, as happened in the world of Windows PCs and was now happening with Android devices. It's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. We believe that it's technology married with the humanities that yields us the result that makes our hearts sing. Nowhere is that more true than in these post-PC devices. Folks are rushing into this tablet market, and they're looking at it as the next PC, in which the hardware and the software are done by different companies. Our experience, and every bone in our body, says that is not the right approach. These are post-PC devices that need to be even more intuitive and easier to use than a PC, and where the software and the hardware and the applications need to be intertwined in an even more seamless way than they are on a PC. We think we have the right architecture, not just in silicon, but in our organization to build these kinds of products. It was an architecture that was bred not just into the organization he had built, but into his own soul. After the launch event, Jobs was energized. He came to the Four Seasons Hotel to join me, his wife, and Reed, plus Reed's two Stanford pals, for lunch. For a change, he was eating, though still with some pickiness. He ordered fresh squeezed juice, which he sent back 3 times, declaring that each new offering was from a bottle, and a pasta primavera, which he shoved away as inedible after one taste. But then he ate half of my crab Louis salad and ordered a full one for himself, followed by a bowl of ice cream. The indulgent hotel was even able to produce a glass of juice that finally met his standards. At his house the following day, he was still on a high. He was planning to fly to Kona Village the next day, alone, and I asked to see what he had put on his iPad 2 for the trip. There were 3 movies: Chinatown, The Bourne Ultimatum, and Toy Story 3. More revealingly, there was just one book that he had downloaded: The Autobiography of a Yogi, the guide to meditation and spirituality that he had first read as a teenager, then reread in India, and had read once a year ever since. Midway through the morning, he decided he wanted to eat something. He was still too weak to drive, so I drove him to a cafe in a shopping mall. It was closed, but the owner was used to Jobs knocking on the door at off hours, and he happily let us in. "He's taken on a mission to try to fatten me up," Jobs joked. His doctors had pushed him to eat eggs as a source of high-quality protein, and he ordered an omelet. Living with a disease like this, and all the pain, constantly reminds you of your own mortality, and that can do strange things to your brain if you're not careful, he said. You don't make plans more than a year out, and that's bad. You need to force yourself to plan as if you will live for many years. An example of this magical thinking was his plan to build a luxurious yacht. The best vacation I've ever been on was when we went down the coast of Italy, then to Athens, which is a pit, but the Parthenon is mind-blowing, and then to Ephesus in Turkey, where they have these ancient public lavatories in marble with a place in the middle for musicians to serenade. When they got to Istanbul, he hired a history professor to give his family a tour. At the end, they went to a Turkish bath where the professor's lecture gave Jobs an insight about the globalization of youth. I had a real revelation. We were all in robes, and they made some Turkish coffee for us. The professor explained how the coffee was made very different from anywhere else, and I realized, so fucking what? Which kids, even in Turkey, give a shit about Turkish coffee? All day I had looked at young people in Istanbul. They were all drinking what every other kid in the world drinks, and they were wearing clothes that looked like they were bought at the Gap, and they are all using cell phones. They were like kids everywhere else. It hit me that for young people, this whole world is the same now. When we're making products, there is no such thing as a Turkish phone or a music player that young people in Turkey would want that's different from one young people elsewhere would want. We're just one world now. After the joy of that cruise, Jobs had amused himself by beginning to design and then repeatedly redesigning a boat he said he wanted to build someday. When he got sick again in 2009, he almost canceled the project. I didn't think I would be alive when it got done, he recalled, but that made me so sad, and I decided that working on the design was fun to do, and maybe I have a shot at being alive when it's done. If I stop work on the boat, and then I make it alive for another 2 years, I would be really pissed. So I've kept going. He and Powell would be celebrating their 20th wedding anniversary a few days later, and he admitted that at times he had not been as appreciative of her as she deserved. I'm very lucky, because you just don't know what you're getting into when you get married, he said. You have an intuitive feeling about things. I couldn't have done better, because not only is Laureen smart and beautiful, she's turned out to be a really good person. For a moment he teared up. He talked about his other girlfriends, particularly Tina Redsey, but said he ended up in the right place. He also reflected on how selfish and demanding he could be. Laureen had to deal with that, and also with me being sick, he said. I know that living with me is not a bowl of cherries. Among his selfish traits was that he tended not to remember anniversaries or birthdays. But in this case, he decided to plan a surprise. They had gotten married at the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite, and he decided to take Powell back there on their anniversary. But when Jobs called, the place was fully booked. So he had the hotel approach the people who had reserved the suite where he and Powell had stayed and ask if they would relinquish it. I offered to pay for another weekend, Jobs recalled, and the man was very nice and said, 20 years? Please take it. It's yours. He found the photographs of the wedding taken by a friend and had large prints made on thick paper boards and placed in an elegant box. Scrolling through his iPhone, he found the note that he had composed to be included in the box and read it aloud. We didn't know much about each other 20 years ago. We were guided by our intuition. You swept me off my feet. It was snowing when we got married at the Ahwahnee. Years passed, kids came, good times, hard times, but never bad times. Our love and respect has endured and grown. We've been through so much together, and here we are right back where we started 20 years ago, older, wiser, with wrinkles on our faces and hearts. We now know many of life's joys, sufferings, secrets, and wonders, and we're still here together. My feet have never returned to the ground." By the end of the recitation, he was crying uncontrollably. When he composed himself, he noted that he had also made a set of the pictures for each of his kids. "I thought they might like to see that I was young once." iCloud. In 2001, Jobs had a vision. Your personal computer would serve as a digital hub for a variety of lifestyle devices, such as music players, video recorders, phones, and tablets. This played to Apple's strength of creating end-to-end products that were simple to use. The company was thus transformed from a high-end niche computer company to the most valuable technology company in the world. By 2008, Jobs had developed a vision for the next wave of the digital era. In the future, he believed, your desktop computer would no longer serve as the hub for your content. Instead, the hub would move to the cloud. In other words, your content would be stored on remote servers managed by a company you trusted, and it would be available for you to use on any device, anywhere. It would take him 3 years to get it right. He began with a false step. In the summer of 2008, he launched a product called Mobile Me, an expensive $99 per year subscription service that allowed you to store your address book, documents, pictures, videos, email, and calendar remotely in the cloud and to sync them with any device. In theory, you could go to your iPhone or any computer and access all aspects of your digital life. There was, however, a big problem. The service, to use Jobs' terminology, sucked.